All right. So as I explained to those of you who were here a minute ago, the speaker for this session tested negative on departure from Norway, where she was, and tested positive on arrival. So she's had to she's being detained and quarantined, and doesn't have Wi-Fi and is sorting out all sorts of other things due to that. So obviously, it's hugely disappointing for her. She's flown all the way from Norway to be here, and so is her partner, and they were really looking forward to this. So I wanted to play the video and give you the opportunity to see all the work that she's put into this tutorial. I'm not a philosopher of psychology, but at the same time, the video will take actually most of the hour. But if there are philosophers in this room, identify yourselves afterwards so that people can talk to you about their philosophy questions. And I'll certainly do my best if anyone comes up to me. But for now, we'll all watch Gabby's video, and I'll let her know that everyone wishes her well, yeah? Yeah, okay.
My video tutorial on philosophy of psychology for machine learning, presented for FACT 2022. Why don't I start by introducing myself? My name is Gabrielle Johnson, and I'm an assistant professor of philosophy at Claremont McKenna College. My work lays at the intersection of three research areas within philosophy. Those are philosophy of mind, philosophy of science, and philosophy of technology. The general approach to my research within these areas is to explore topics that overlap within these domains and investigate to what extent the different disciplinary perspectives can shape and inform one another with respect to those topics. Today, I'd like to take a look at three such topics at the intersection of psychology and machine learning. Those topics, in the order that we'll discuss them, are first, social and perceptual bias, second, conceptual representation semantics, and third, cognitive architecture. The goal of each section will be to first introduce the key concepts and to get a sense of how work within empirical psychology and machine learning each utilize those concepts in empirical explanations. We'll then compare and contrast the explanatory roles these concepts play with the aim of coming away with a more unified understanding of the nature of each of the concepts. Okay, so let's get started with the topic of social and perceptual bias. I'm going to start by just introducing an intuitive case that involves social bias. Imagine one day you're at work and you have a friend, Jan, who's having trouble joining a Zoom tutorial. And let's just say you have another colleague, we'll call him E, and E attempts to help Jan join the Zoom tutorial. Of course, she didn't ask for help, he just volunteered it. And afterward, you go up to E and you say, "Hey E, why did you attempt to help Jan join the Zoom tutorial? She didn't ask for help." And he explains to you, "Oh, it's easy. You see, Jan is elderly. Elderly people are bad at computers, and so Jan must be bad with computers." This is a standard example of what psychologists call explicit bias. And the reason why it's called explicit bias is because E is entirely aware of the social stereotype that he's using to make inferences about Jan. That is, he is aware of his belief that elderly people are bad with computers and the role that plays within his inference about Jan. But, of course, not all biases operate in ways that are so obvious to the individuals who are harboring them. For example, let's imagine another scenario, this time involving our colleague T. So T, like E, attempts to help Jan join the Zoom tutorial. However, when we ask T why she attempted to help Jan join the tutorial, she reports no belief that elderly people are bad with computers. In fact, when we ask her if she thinks that elderly people are bad with computers, she denies this and says that elderly people are just as good with computers as anyone else's. So this is a standard example of what psychologists call implicit biases. And the reason why the bias is implicit here is because it seems like we have to, in order to explain T's behavior, posit the existence of some mental entity which is non-obvious to T herself, and that plays the same role for her as the social stereotype did for E, namely, taking us from the premise that Jan is elderly to the conclusion that Jan is bad with computers. It's then within the purview of empirical studies of implicit bias to theorize about what that mental entity could be constituted by. A very straightforward approach to this question might be to just posit that she has the same mental states as E does, namely a belief that elderly people are bad with computers. So In the case of T, she has a belief that elderly people are bad with computers. It's just the case that that belief is unconscious.
Sorry, we're getting an echo for the online crew, but I don't think we have to do anything about that.
A very straightforward approach to this question might be to just posit that she has the same mental states as E does, namely a belief that elderly people are bad with computers. So in the case of T, she has a belief that elderly people are bad with computers. It's just the case that that belief is unconscious. So she has an unconscious belief that elderly people are bad with computers. This approach that theorizes that the relevant mental entity is an unconscious belief is quite common in philosophical theories of implicit bias. However, a more popular theory among social psychologists is an associationist view. According to the associationist view, T doesn't harbor any propositional attitudes like beliefs of the form elderly people are bad with computers. Rather, what explains her transition from Jen is elderly to Jen is bad with computers is a simple association between two concepts. And to say that two concepts are associated is just to say that when one concept activates, so too does the other concept. So in the example of her inference about Jen, the idea is that T might have a simple association between the two concepts, elderly and being bad with computers. So when her elderly concept activates, so too does her bad with computers concept activate. And so she transitions from Jen is elderly to Jen is bad with computers. Notice the contrast between these two approaches. One approach says that the bias involved is a sentence of the form elderly people are bad with computers. The other says that there is a simple association between two solitary concepts. So these are two different approaches to the psychological study of social bias. We can contrast these two approaches with still a third example of how social biases might manifest in some computational system. This third example comes from machine learning programs in the form of so-called algorithmic bias. So I love to start off discussions about algorithmic bias by discussing the example of Tay. Tay was a Twitter chatbot that was released by Microsoft, and the goal was that she was supposed to mimic the language patterns of a 19-year-old American girl. She operated, as many Twitter chatbots do, by learning from the language patterns of human Twitter users with whom she was interacting. And perhaps unsurprisingly, she lasted only about 16 hours before Microsoft had to pull the plug. For some reason, Tay began authoring a number of offensive tweets, endorsing Nazi ideology, discriminating against women and people of color, and harassing other Twitter users. Here's just one example of the bizarre behavior that Tay began exhibiting soon after her launch. So naturally, people had questions. When asked why Tay was behaving badly, Microsoft issued a statement. They said, as Tay learns, some of its responses are inappropriate and indicative of the types of interactions some people are having with it. In other words, Tay's noxious personality was inherited from the individuals with whom she was engaging. This gives rise to the often cited motto in machine learning of garbage in, garbage out. Now, the reason why I don't love Tay as an example across the board is because, in fact, in the case of Tay, we know for sure that it was garbage coming in. So it was the online community 4chan that hijacked Tay and bombarded her with a bunch of noxious texts. And that's what explains why she began behaving the way that she did. But of course, at this point, there are plenty of examples of problematic social biases manifesting in machine learning programs that are trained on what could arguably be regarded as comprehensive representative data. For example, consider the case of word embedding software for natural language processors, or NLPs. In one study, researchers studied software that was trained on what's called the common crawl. This is a huge assemblage of real-world text collected by bots crawling across and collecting random text on the internet. The study found that many of the word embeddings mimicked associations commonly exhibited on psychological tests for implicit bias, like the implicit association test. For example, software was more often to pair stereotypical female names with family words than with career terms, stereotypical African American names with unpleasant words than with pleasant words, and male terms with science and math terms than with art terms. And this is perhaps unsurprising when we consider the sort of text that we see collected on the internet. For example, other studies have shown that individuals are more than 2.5 times likely to Google, "Is my son gifted?" than "Is my daughter gifted?" And so it's because these social biases are ubiquitous in the human-generated data on which they're trained that the machine learning programs pick up on and emulate those same biases in their operations. One of the most famous examples of problematic social biases manifesting in the machine learning programs comes in the form of COMPAS. So COMPAS is a recidivism risk algorithm. Its purpose is to predict the likelihood for reoffense among defendants. It operates by first being trained on information about defendants and then using that information together with past arrest data to come up with a prediction that some defendant is likely to reoffend. The scores are then used by judges and others in the criminal justice system in order to make decisions about, among other things, bail and pretrial detention. Back of the envelope analysis of COMPAS by ProPublica discovered that the formula was particularly likely to falsely flag Black defendants as feature criminals, wrongly labeling them this way almost twice the rate as white defendants, and likewise to falsely label white defendants as low risk more often than Black defendants. So we're seeing more false positives among Black defendants, while there are more false negatives among white defendants. This struck many as a straightforward example of racial bias in the operation of COMPAS. Now, there's a lot to say about COMPAS, especially involving the so-called possibility result that we're not going to get to in today's discussion. But we can use COMPAS as a sort of test case for thinking through some of the more theoretical concepts that we're going to come across along the way. For now, we can just consider it in conjunction with the other cases explored as establishing the now uncontroversial claim that the very same social biases we see in human psychology can and do manifest in computer systems as well. But this raises a further question of how precisely social biases operate in machine learning programs. Are they like the sentences in our head when we have an explicit bias? Or are they more like the simple associations we see in the cases of implicit bias? Or are they the result of some other computational mechanism altogether? Actually, looking at examples of machine learning bias helps to establish that there are in fact many different algorithmic decision procedures that can give rise to what seems like the very same social bias. I'll demonstrate this point using yet another example, this time in the form of a simple k-nearest neighbors classification. Imagine you are tasked with building an algorithm intended to classify individuals as either good or bad computers. The algorithm you build is very simple. It operates on the basis of just one feature, a person's age. You begin the training process by collecting data in the form of information about individuals that you know to be a certain age and who you know are good or bad with computers. So let's say we collect those data and plot them on a simple one-dimensional feature space as seen here. As you'll notice, our data appears skewed. On the whole, it seems like people who are good with computers tend toward the younger end of the age spectrum, and those who are bad with computers tend toward the older end. It is critical in discussions of algorithmic bias to recognize that the data themselves don't tell us why this pattern is emerging the way that it is. One explanation, as in the case of today, is that we have unrepresentative data. Perhaps we collected them at, say, an after-school charity event where high schoolers volunteer to help train elderly individuals who struggle with technology. In that case, we would expect our data to disproportionately represent elderly individuals with bad computers compared to the general population. And there are other problematic data collection practices that might result in this trend. Perhaps the person labeling the training data due to their own personal biases is just more likely to label elderly individuals as bad with computers even when they're not. Perhaps a more theoretically interesting explanation, however, is when we see these social biases manifesting despite good data collection practices. So this is more like when the word embedding software manifested social biases. It's possible that in these cases, the trend is just ubiquitous in the social environment in which we find ourselves. Even in that case, however, the data don't themselves explain the deeper relationship between the features and the category labels. Crucially, all the data tell us are that the two are statistically correlated with one another. They don't tell us anything about causal relationships between them. It might be, though it seems unlikely, just a natural fact about elderly people that they have some sort of innate inability to learn technology. Or, perhaps more likely, it might be that society is structured in such a way that we've made it difficult for elderly individuals to gain educational access to new technologies. The data still, we can capitalize on the mere statistical relationship between the two in order to make reliable predictions. So during the training phase, the algorithm is provided the opportunity to learn the relationship between features and labels. Once it's done so, we can let it loose on new data. Those are individuals that we know the feature values for, but not the category labels. So let's say we come across one such data. The algorithm, knowing the age of the individual, can plot them on its feature space and then use its similarity to other data within the feature space to make a prediction about whether they're good or bad with computers. Again, it's really important to realize that there are still infinitely many ways to make this statistical inference. Because there are infinitely many ways one thing can be like another, there's simply not just one decision procedure. In order to keep things simple, I'm just going to use the k nearest neighbors algorithm, where we look to the 5 nearest neighbors. We then give those 5 nearest neighbors a majority vote as to whether this new individual should be labeled as good or bad with computers. And we see in this case, the 5 nearest neighbors have a majority of those who are bad with computers. So this new individual will, because of their age, be labeled as bad with computers. Thus, we can think of this whole feature space with the data plotted within it as they are, as roughly encoding the stereotype that elderly people are bad with computers. And importantly, the representation of that stereotype in this feature space is very different from a sort of rule or sentence along the lines of, if someone is elderly, then they're bad with computers. There's no explicit representation of that content, and that's important because if we were to, for example, program our computer with the opposite of that rule, if we were to say it's not the case that elderly people are bad with computers, we would see no breakdown of how this computational system is operating. And that's because we don't have anything like an explicit rule representing the stereotype. Instead, the stereotype implicitly emerges out of a combination of innocuous states and processes. In this case, we set the parameter of k to be 5, and we use the Euclidean distance function to estimate the predictions on the basis of the other data. So it's these innocuous rules that are explicitly represented, together with the data on which it's trained, that roughly encode the stereotype that elderly people are bad. And so this general purpose learning algorithm is just one example among many of the sorts of computational procedures that we see can give rise to social bias. One might wonder now, what do all of these cases, some of which come from psychology, some from machine learning, what do they all have in common? Is there any general notion of bias or social bias in particular that we can make sense of across these domains? Given their differences, in virtue of what exactly are we apt to call all of them cases of bias against the elderly? I think there's something we can't say here about their commonalities, and I believe that by recognizing both their similarities and their differences, we can learn something deeper about the nature of bias itself. So let's line up the cases again. Although what we see here looks like 3 very different combinations of states and processes, notice that they all have in common the same functional profile. That is, they all have the same input-output profile. They all take as an input Jan, and the fact that she's elderly, and they all provide as an output that Jan is bad with computers. I propose that this functional profile is what is essential to a bias's operation. That is, social bias in all of its many manifestations is at bottom just the sort of thing that takes us from inputs pairing together individuals with their social kind categories to outputs pairing those same individuals with properties that are stereotypical of the relevant social kind. In other words, biases are just whatever allows us to instantiate social kind abductions. Crucially, recognizing the functional role that bias plays helps to highlight the many different bias mechanisms that can play this role. This more general definition of social bias also allows us to see what's in common between social and non-social cases of bias. So let's now turn to the example of looking at this image, assuming your visual system is operating normally, you'll likely see the flat image as appearing to have depth. In particular, you'll likely see that the circle on the left is convex and the circle on the right is concave. In fact, the image in front of you is flat, so strictly speaking, this is a perceptual illusion. However, more often than not, when you run across this sort of scene in the natural environment, you're likely to get it right. That is, more often than not, when you see luminance patterns displayed as they are here, it's likely to be caused by an object that is convex on the left and is concave on the right. How does your visual system get things right so often? Why is it getting things wrong now? Answering these questions is at the heart of modern day vision science. And the answer is more complicated than you might expect. That's because the information your visual system has access to in order to make a prediction about the distal object vastly underdetermines the right answer. So let's take a closer look. The story starts with the light shining onto and then bouncing off of some distal object in front of you. That light travels from the distal object into your retina. In fact, we never have direct access to the distal objects. That's why they're distal, they're far away. Instead, we only ever have access to the light just as it hits our retina, what we'll call the proximal stimulation or light registration. In this case, a flat two-dimensional image on our retina. The visual system then uses that proximal registration of light as data on the basis of which to make an inference or prediction about the depth of the three-dimensional object out there in the environment. The result of that inference is what constitutes your visual perception. That is, you see the object as three-dimensional despite only ever having access to two-dimensional information. This is actually a pretty impressive feat. How does the visual system do this? The answer is that your visual system makes an assumption about what pattern is normal in the wider environment. In other words, your visual system has a bias about what it thinks is natural. In this case, the bias is the assumption that light comes from above. It has this bias because, in general, for creatures like us, light does come from above. If we were different creatures that evolved in a very different environment than the one we did, for example, if we were deep sea creatures for whom light typically comes from below, then our visual systems would make very different assumptions. And the results would be very different as well. Then we would have perceptual representations where the circle on the left looked concave and the circle on the right looked convex. Here we see again that bias is guiding inference in the face of evidence that seems to underdetermine the conclusions we might draw. Likewise, for image recognition software, a computer program trained on images of this sort would, without any further information, face a huge underdetermination problem. It would have two options, actually many more than two, but at least two options for how to categorize the image, both of which would be perfectly consistent with the evidence, but only one of which could be right. Thus, if we want this program to make accurate predictions, it will need to adopt a bias like the one that exists in our visual perceptual systems. Once this bias is adopted by the system, it will reliably guide inference, ruling out solutions that are statistically unlikely and allowing the system to arrive at outputs that accurately. So now we're seeing even more forms that bias can take. In the case of social bias, bias functions to encode assumptions about what patterns are normal in the environment, so as to take us from evidence about what social group someone belongs to inferences about what properties are stereotypical of that group. In the case of perceptual bias, bias also functions to include assumptions about what patterns are normal. In that case, to take us from evidence in the form of shallow two-dimensional registrations to inferences about rich properties and objects that are the cause of those registrations. In all of these cases, I contend, what makes bias the thing that it is this functional role. Okay, so let's take a step back and ask what conclusions we can draw about the nature of social and perceptual bias in both humans and machines. We might start with just this general question. What is a bias? What is bias? The answer, given to us throughout the examples that we've seen, is that bias is fundamentally a functional kind, and therefore multiply realizable. That is, many different combinations of states and processes can realize the exact same functional profile. Bias in general is a system's response to underdetermination. Crucially, bias systematically takes us from underdetermining inputs to outputs, and because of that, bias guides inference. Now, with this general view of bias in hand, we can start to tackle broader philosophical questions about how bias operates. In particular, as philosophers, we might ask questions such as, when is bias bad, and what makes it bad? Does bias pick out a heterogeneous or a unified phenomenon? And how do we intervene on bad cases of bias? In what follows, I'll gesture at answers that this functional approach to bias can provide. I won't spend a lot of time arguing for these answers here. Rather, the point is just to demonstrate the array of answers that the functional approach to bias makes viable. Let's start with the first question. When is a bias bad? What makes a bias bad? According to the functional approach, there will be different answers depending on the norms of evaluation we're interested in. Ultimately, since bias is fundamentally what relates inputs to outputs, how we evaluate bias will depend on whether it guides us from inputs to outputs in better or worse ways. So, for example, in the case of epistemic evaluation, bias is bad when it leads us away from truth rather than toward it. In the case of moral evaluation, bias is bad when it leads us toward morally objectionable ends rather than away from them. And finally, in the case of pragmatic evaluation, bias is bad. Does bias pick out a heterogeneous or unified phenomenon? According to the functional view of bias, the answer is both. Bias is unified by its functional role in overcoming underdetermination. However, it's also multiply realizable. Many different computational states and processes can fill this role. And finally, how do we intervene on bad cases of bias? According to the functional view of bias, it depends. Biases are internal mechanisms that aim to track environmental regularities. With this view of bias in mind, we can actually distinguish between two basic approaches, which we can call internal and external approaches. Internal approaches target the internal mechanisms themselves. The sorts of changes that we might make to these computational procedures will tend to be varied, fast, and short-lived. But we can contrast those with what we might call external approaches. Those attempt to mitigate the environmental regularities that we find problematic. These sorts of changes will be uniform, they'll be extremely slow, but they'll also be quite long-lasting. And so we see benefits and costs to those approaches. I suspect that to permanently dismantle problematic biases, we'll likely have to adopt a mixed strategy that targets both internal and external mechanisms. This is because of the complex feedback loops that exist between the internal and the external, which themselves exist, again, due to the role of bias in allowing our systems to make assumptions about what's normal in the external environment. Okay, so that's part one on our tour through our three theoretical notions. The next topic I want to discuss is a theory about conceptual representation semantics. In other words, I want to explore the questions of what representations within human minds and machine learning algorithms mean, and to what extent we can expect them to share the same meaning. Okay, so let's just jump right in. I want to start by returning to the case of Compass. Recall, Compass is the recidivism risk software that predicts the likelihood of reoffense. It's also the software that was found to have problematic biases against Black defendants. Now, you might have been thinking, how exactly is Compass operating such that we're seeing these sorts of social biases manifest? Of course, if we wanted to know for sure how Compass is operating, you might think the easiest solution is to just pop it open and see if it's operating with some kind of explicit rule, like if a defendant is Black, then they're high risk. Of course, it's not easily done, especially in the case of programs like Compass, because these programs are proprietary. That is, they're kept secret for consumer commercial advantage, and the companies that own them don't want to share them for public scrutiny. It's also the case that sometimes these algorithms instantiate what's called a black box algorithm. So these are algorithms that are so computationally complex that even very good computer engineers can't explain why they're operating the way that they are, why we're getting the transition from inputs to outputs the ways that we are. Of course, it's unlikely that Compass is operating with such complex algorithms. Probably what's happening under the hood is no more complex than simple linear regression. But for all of these reasons, it's hard to investigate the exact operation of the recidivism risk algorithm. That said, we do have some information about the inputs that Compass has access to. So each defendant fills out a questionnaire comprising over 100 questions that give the algorithm information about each defendant on the basis of which to make its predictions about recidivism. And what's interesting about these inputs is allegedly they do not have access to racial demographic information. So race is not one of the inputs on the basis of which Compass is making its predictions. That makes it all the more surprising that we're seeing the outputs with pattern in ways that suggest racial bias the ways that they do. The reason why we see these results, despite the fact that Compass doesn't have access to race, is that Compass has access to other features that tend to correlate with race. So because neighborhoods tend to be racially homogeneous, something like zip code can act as a... Now, it's because computer algorithms like Compass operate using such a large combination of various different features, often ones that humans are unlikely to pair together or to track, that make the question about representation and meaning within the computational system so interesting. Because the combinations are often so complex, there is an open question about whether or not these collections of features can be thought of as representing race itself. So, for example, to give you a real-world scenario in which this question got traction, the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development actually brought up a lawsuit against Facebook for their ad targeting software. So it was alleged that Facebook was allowing users to decide who would be given ads for certain housing opportunities on the basis of race. And so the Department of Housing and Urban Development reminded Facebook that it is unlawful to discriminate against any person in the terms, conditions, or privileges of the sale or rental of dwelling, or in the provision of services or facilities in connection therewith, because of race, color, religion, sex, familial status, national origin, or disability. And there are a number of statutes that were cited in the making of this complaint. And so, in an attempt to dismiss the lawsuit, Facebook responded, and they said Facebook does not collect information on the race, ethnicity of its users, and does not permit users to provide that information to their user profiles. Instead, users become part of a multicultural affinity when, through their activities on Facebook, they express an interest in content related to one or more culture and communities. These affinities are based on expressed interest and not race or ethnicity. So the basic idea is that Facebook claims they couldn't possibly have their algorithm discriminating on the basis of race because it doesn't even have access to race as one of the inputs to the system. Instead, all they have access to are the various activities on Facebook that suggest a multicultural affinity. But, of course, activities, expressed interests, and multicultural affinities all correlate with race. And so this gives rise to what's called the proxy problem. In cases where some target feature correlates with some non-target proxy feature, when is some event or decision because of the target rather than the proxy? And the answer, evidenced by Facebook's response, was an appeal to what's sometimes called fairness through unawareness. So an algorithm is fair as long as any protected attributes A are not explicitly used in the decision-making process. So all of this suggests an open question as to when exactly some attribute or property is explicitly represented in the algorithm itself. And this question, I think, is ultimately a question about meaning or representation, one that theories within philosophy of psychology and philosophy of mind more generally are in a good position to respond to. And so let's start by taking a look at a standard example of when we posit perceptual representations. So consider again staring at this scene progress over time. You see a door open. Presumably, if your visual system is operating normally, you don't see the door as wildly changing shape as it opens. You see the door as remaining a constant rectangular shape. This is despite the fact that actually the information that your visual system does have direct access to does drastically change over the course of the door opening. That is, the sensory registrations as they hit your eye do radically change over time. They change from what seems like a solid rectangular shape to something that is very isosceles trapezoidal. And so again, we have a sort of computational problem where the information that your visual system has access to seems to underdetermine the sorts of representational states that it could posit as the best explanation for the distal scene. And this is a computational problem that your visual system often solves well. That is, despite the proximal information that you have access to drastically changing, your visual system is able to bootstrap its way to a representation of rectangularity that remains constant throughout the encounter. And so this gives rise to a general phenomenon on which we posit representations. When doing so, helps us explain our ability to reliably track and causally interact with some distal objects. Now, what's most important about this example is that it illustrates for us that no computational system is ever limited to just the inputs that it has direct access to. It's because of the computational procedures that some system instantiates that it's able to bootstrap its way from those proximal registrations to robust representations of the distal environment. And so now we can just straightforwardly see the confusion that's being made in the case of compass. That is, Nothing in principle rules out that Compass couldn't be using the questionnaire, the innocuous proxy features that it has access to bootstrap its way to bona fide representation of race. And of course, the question of when it's explicitly using race would be best answered by those instances where we need to posit those explanations in order to explain our ability to reliably track and causally interact with physical objects. In the case of Compass, the idea is that if when looking at the many combinations of innocuous proxy features that the system does have direct access to, it seems we lack a plausible explanation for why those features would be the ones used. That is, the collection to us looks arbitrary or gerrymandered, or there's no obvious connection between these many different proxy features, unless, of course, we avail ourselves of the opportunity to reference race as a causal explanatory antecedent to those features hanging together the way that they do. In those scenarios, we have a plausible case for when we would need to posit explicit representations of race in order to explain why the program is operating the way that it is. Without race, it seems like the explanations that we could provide, the ones that only make reference to the proxy features and nothing else, those I'm not going to be able to make the case that we do have to mention race in order to explain why Compass is operating the way that it is. But I do think that the fact that equality advocates are highlighting the racial discrepancies in the outputs, that fact can be taken as evidence of the best scientific explanation for why Compass is operating the way that it does indeed require reference to race. And it is therefore good evidence that it is explicitly representing race. But I just don't have the time to make the full case here. Instead, I want to introduce a possible objection to the claim that machine learning programs could be representing race in the same way that we do, which would itself forestall claims that it's representing race at all. In order to understand this objection, we need to get clear on a potential distinction between two different kinds of concepts that we might be utilizing. So consider a simple example. Take the case of representing a cat. There are a lot of features about the cat that we might recognize as surface level features. So the cat has whiskers, it meows, it has sharp claws. We could, in theory, come across another creature that has all of those same superficial properties. So this creature has whiskers, it meows, it has sharp claws. But it just so happens that the first creature, the cat, has some deep underlying cat essence, some feature hidden in perhaps its DNA, and it's in the virtue of having that essence that it has the superficial properties that it does. So it's because cats have the DNA that they do, that they tend to have the superficial properties that they do. Of course, any cat could have that DNA but lack any one of these superficial properties, and so too this other creature could have some other sort of DNA, so not a cat essence, but still have all the same superficial properties that a cat has. So who knows, maybe it's like a cleverly disguised robot. So on the inside there's no DNA, it's really just automata that happens to have all of the same superficial properties. But of course, cats aren't really automata, and so these two things can't both be cats on one control of what a cat is. And so we're going to call that control of what a cat is that tracks the essence rather than the superficial properties as a sort of deep concept. So this is our deep concept cat, and it tracks any creature that has the underlying essence irrespective of the superficial properties. So it might be that some creature has the DNA, but for various reasons might lack the superficial properties. It's not hard to imagine cats that don't have whiskers, don't meow, don't have sharp claws. And the fact that we're able to imagine that shows that our concept cat tracks something like a deep essence. Contrast that with a different sort of concept that might merely track those superficial properties. So this concept cat just tracks the superficial properties, and so this other creature, this automata that has the superficial properties irrespective of not having the cat essence, would still be a cat in the superficial sense. And so what's important for us is just that we can conceptually pull apart those two concepts. That is, the deep notion of cat isn't the same as whatever concept tracks just the superficial properties. And we can see how that's true by virtue of the fact that the first creature is a cat in the deep sense, but the second creature isn't, whereas both are cats in the superficial sense. This distinction tracks roughly the distinction in psychology of psychological essentialism. So this is the idea that certain category concepts, such as biological kinds like lion and female, have an underlying reality that cannot be observed directly. And the idea is that human beings have this sort of essentialism bias. And the way that they test for this is to give experiments where subjects are asked certain questions to see whether or not their answers track appearances or some underlying reality. So here's an example of one of the tests for psychological essentialism, where in this scenario we have a flamingo, a blackbird in the lower right. I know it looks a little light in the image, but it's much darker when they give the experiment, and then they have a bat. And the idea is that the bird is much similar in appearances to the bat, but much similar in kind. That is, it's also a bird with a flamingo. And so then they'll ask some question like, the flamingo has a left aortic arch and the bat has a right aortic arch. What do you think the blackbird will have? And subjects tend to answer in ways that suggest it would be more similar to the flamingo, even though it shares more visual similarity with the bat. Likewise, they give experiments to small children where they have a leaf and a bug, and then they have a leaf bug, and they ask the small children whether they think the leaf bug will have more features in common with the leaf or with the bug. And more often than not, children will respond that the leaf bug is more like the bug, even though it shares more visual resemblance with the leaf. And so this suggests that the category concepts are tracking some deep underlying essence that can float freely of the superficial properties. So they're attributing the same kind membership despite not sharing the superficial similarities. And so the three key signatures of essentialized kind are that they're thought to have rich correlated structures. That is, they have causal structures. It's the underlying essence that is causally responsible for the superficial properties, even if in some cases those superficial properties don't come to fruition. These structures are in some sense hidden and not identifiable based on simple perceptual properties, and new learned features about one kind member will often be projected through implicit or explicit inference to other kind members to a large extent, irrespective of perceptual similarity. And what's important for us is just that research shows that many concepts, including biological and social kinds, are essentialized for humans. That is, they do not rely primarily on visual similarity. And so in cases where you have a thought like the cat is on the mat, the concept that you utilize in building that thought is a deep concept. It's one that tracks something like a cat essence, something that would be attributed to cats even if the superficial properties weren't there. Contrast that with the way that artificial neural net architectures tend to work. In particular, the advent of big data has made it the case that these architectures are really good at pattern identification, and crucially, those patterns are based on superficial properties. So if given some image of, say, a cat, they would likely identify various features of the cat, like whiskers or sharp claws, that then go into the deep neural net using the system of weights the way that it does to produce a categorization of a cat. And the reason why we know that the image is likely using these superficial properties is that when we get some other creature that we ourselves wouldn't identify as a cat, but that has all of the same superficial properties of a cat, the system will categorize as a cat. This feature of the systems, that is, its reliance on superficial properties, is exactly what makes it susceptible to various adversarial attacks. And so we see that in certain images, making arbitrary changes that wouldn't at all prompt a human to think that their category has changed, do prompt the system to think that the category has changed. And so this gives evidence that the sorts of features that individuals are using for kind membership and concept acquisition are very different between humans and machines. So the idea is when a computer has a thought, loosely speaking, of the cat is on the mat, the concepts that it utilizes in that thought are ones that are tracking mere superficial properties and not deep essences. And that's to be contrasted with the established fact that humans are using the deep concepts. So when they have the thought, they're using a concept that tracks cat essence. And because the cat essence can come apart from the superficial properties, it seems that the two concepts are not the same. And so using that sort of line of reasoning to then address the case of compass, it seems plausible that if what compass is tracking are just superficial properties that are correlated with race, but can never get at the deeper features that we take to be essential to race, and in this case, I'll just make a note that psychological essentialism is the assumption that certain kinds have deep underlying essences, maybe biological essences. It's certainly not the claim that they do, in fact, have deep underlying biological essences. It's just that humans have a bias that seems to assume that there is some underlying reality to group membership. And so in these sorts of cases where social kinds are essentialized for better or worse, it seems like a concept that, and this seems to suggest that whatever representations the two systems are capable of will be very different. And so the conceptual representation semantics for the two, the meanings behind the representations within the computational systems will be very different. Okay, so that was part 2 on the similarities and differences between conceptual representation semantics with respect to human minds and machine minds. I'm going to end with part 3, just discussing cognitive architecture. And in this part, I'll bring in some of the themes from the first 2 to see if we can come up with any general lessons about the relationship between psychology and machine learning. Okay, so when we talk about cognitive architecture, we're talking about architecture in a somewhat familiar sense. In particular, we're talking about the relationship of different parts of the cognitive system and how they relate to one another. So you could think of it as like the architecture of your home, telling you how different parts of your home are related to other parts of your home. If you're confused, just think of it as structure. So to what extent do we have to have some built-in structure to how the cognitive system is built? And so in the case of the human mind, ever since Fodor wrote, that is Jerry Fodor wrote a very famous book called The Modularity of Mind, people have posited that the mind can be broken up into smaller and smaller different components, what he calls modules. And then there's a theory about how information is passed between and among modules. And so the idea is that cognition is essentially split into 2 large units. The first unit is central cognitive capacities. That's where all of our high-level propositional attitudes, our concepts, our beliefs, our thoughts, our desires, our fears, our hopes, that's where all of that high-level stuff is stored. And that can be contrasted with the perceptual modules. So each perceptual system has its own module. We have the visual module, the taste module, the auditory module, etc. And then the idea is that on a very simple view of how various parts of the mind relate to one another, information might flow freely between these various different modules. And so dating back to New Look psychologists, the concern was that your various background beliefs, the high-level stuff, beliefs, desires that you have, could affect the way that you perceive the world. And so famously, the sorts of examples that gave evidence to this sort of free flow of information between cognition and perception were cases like the Mueller liar. So this is another perceptual illusion where presumably if your visual system is operating normally, you'll see the top line and the middle part of the top image as longer than the middle part of the bottom image. And this is despite the fact that the 2 lines are exactly the same length. And so there's this question of why your visual perceptual system sees the image the way that it does. And new look psychologists answered this question by, again, appeal to bias or assumptions. So the idea was your visual perceptual system makes assumptions about how these lines are appearing in your normal environment. And with the lines patterned the way that the top line was patterned suggests that it is representing some object that is farther away, whereas the bottom line is patterned so that it corresponds to the objects that are nearer. And so if you get that kind of distribution of lines, it suggests that the thing that's far away, in order to have the exact same retinal registration of the same length, would have to be a bigger object. And so your visual system, based on those assumptions, represents the top line as longer. And so all of this is just supposed to be evidence that your background beliefs and assumptions about the way that the world is go into determining how your visual perceptual system operates. So we see that perception, of course, affects belief. It's because of what you see that you have certain beliefs, perceptual beliefs that you do. And then the idea is that beliefs too can sort of reach down and affect the way that you see the world. Very famously, this very same example of the Mueller liar was used to, in some ways, turn the tables on the new look psychologists. So in a very famous article, Jerry Coder makes the case that it's observations like these that suggest that, in fact, perception is highly modular. That is, it is encapsulated from higher cognitive capacities. And the evidence for that is simply that now that you know that the two lines are the same length, that is, hopefully at this point you have developed the belief that the two lines are the same length, that, of course, doesn't allow you to see the lines any differently. That belief isn't reaching down into perception and changing the way that you see the lines so that you see them more accurately. You can't help but still see them as different lengths. This is perhaps more forceful in more striking illusions. So here's another example where the part of the cube that the arrow is pointing to on the left side is exactly the same color as the part of the cube that the arrow is pointing to on the right side. So even though it looks green on the left and looks red on the right, in fact, it's the exact same color. The same thing is happening in this illusion where A and B, those squares are exactly the same shape, even though A looks much darker than B. And so the idea is, even though I've told you, maybe you paused the video and looked for yourself and noticed that A and B are exactly the same shape, that won't make it the case that you'll be able to see them as the same shade. And so all of this is evidence that your background beliefs are, in fact, incapable of affecting the way that your visual perceptual system operates. And so then it just becomes a question of what other features do perceptual modules have in common. And so Fodor in his book lays out 9 different features of modularity: domain specificity, mandatory operation, limited central accessibility, fast processing, informational encapsulation, shallow outputs, fixed neural architecture, characteristic and specific breakdown patterns, characteristic ontogenetic pace and sequencing. And so without going through all of these in detail, I'll just highlight a few of the features and why they're important for psychological theory of why our cognitive systems operate how they do. In particular, you can think of the distinction, the separability of perception from cognition as aiding in very fast perceptual judgment. So the idea is, throughout evolutionary history, it was extremely advantageous that our perceptual systems would have the sort of domain specificity that they do, that they could very quickly come up with a perceptual representation of the scene in front of us. So the idea is, it's got one job to do: identify what that creature is and whether or not it's dangerous, and it's on the basis of being able to do that one job very quickly without, for example, pausing to take into consideration all of your many background beliefs and desires and fears in order to create that representation, that you're then able to very quickly make the decision to run and thus survive longer. So it's by constraining the sort of information that the visual system has access to that it's able to do its job as well as it does. And so in drawing comparisons now to machine learning, the idea is just to what extent should we expect machine learning programs, if we're building them to operate the same way that human cognitive systems do, to what extent should we build in some sort of robust structure or architecture? So very famously, Jan LeCun explored exactly this comparative question by contrasting various computational architectures with more or less structure. What he found was that certain identification tests were more accurate when some innate structure was built into the model, and thus convolution was invented. So we can contrast, for example, artificial neural nets that are fully connected, where each node has equal access to every other node. Speaking very roughly, this would be sort of like the free flow of information posted by the new book Psychologists. And with this free flow, we run into all kinds of framing and overfitting problems. And so it's by limiting the informational access between the nodes, that is, building in more innate structure, that we're able to get dedicated layers that work to generalize and abstract information more efficiently. And crucially, it is exactly this sort of abstracting that convolutional neural networks allows for that I think will ultimately allow us to overcome the conceptual mismatch problem that we saw before. That is, allowing each layer to be dedicated to abstracting from a mere summary of superficial properties to generalizable properties that go beyond the mere pooling of superficial properties is precisely what will enable them to eventually admit a sort of appearances versus reality distinction that humans are prone to. So in these cases, it's by emulating the robust cognitive architecture of the human mind and crucially distinguishing in large part between perception and cognition that we will eventually get a robust matching between humans and machines. And in order to build that robust architecture, we have to be aware of the sorts of biases that go into the various cognitive systems and subsystems. So as we talked about, the perceptual system has access to some perceptual biases. The human cognitive system has access to a whole host of other essentializing and stereotyping biases. And it's through the utilization of these biases built into the architecture of the computational systems that we get the sort of conceptual matches that we do. And it's these sorts of explanations that make use of robust notions, like the concepts involved, the biases going into the arrangement of the cognitive architecture that will allow us to better understand the various operations of the machine learning programs and to identify cases of problematic biases as the sorts of problematic biases that we should be looking to mitigate. Okay, so that is everything. Hopefully you've now seen how these various notions overlap between machine learning and psychology and the philosophical implications that
All right, everybody. Thank you so much. That was great. I really enjoyed it. If you're a philosopher, can you stand up? Philosophers in the room. Come on, Beba. All right. Well, there's lunch now, so grab a philosopher if you want to ask questions about any of that, and have lunch with them. And thank you all for coming. And yeah, we'll see you at the next session.